Welcome to this ministry video from Muswell Hill Baptist Church.
I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice to worship you, oh my soul, rejoice.
We're coming to the end of Ephesians, and Paul has a finally, chapter 6 and verse 10. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Now, not everybody's finallys can be well organised. Relatively famously, Winston Churchill, who had such a reputation for great phrases and oratory, some of whose phrases are commonly known in the English language, allegedly, as his final words, said, "I'm bored with it all," which was probably true, but a disappointing sentence on which to leave the world. Well, as he comes to the end of his letter, Paul has some important things to say, finally. So having said so much about what the church is and how the church should behave, one of the New Testament's greatest pieces of writing, he now says what matters most among all the things that matter for the Ephesian believers. And it is to be strong in the Lord. Or as we might say, it is to remain standing, even though it's a struggle. And so he comes to the armour of the Christian, the resources that are available to the Christian. And he describes them, first of all, like this. Put on the full armour of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. It is a spiritual resource for a spiritual battle. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armour of God. There are resources available as we battle our way through our spiritual life, and therefore our whole life in this mixed world. It's a struggle. It is a wrestling. This is really the meaning of this word in the original language. It is, if you like, one-on-one. Now, this is very different to the idea that we are fighting against some impersonal force. We are fighting structures and things that have been put in place, but those things have been put in place by a cunning mind. And so even though there are many unwitting people who are carrying out the devil's will, it is simply put the devil's will that we are really contending with. And those spiritual forces that he brings to bear, which as a human being I will not understand properly, but have the resources to fight effectively because of the power of God and the armour of God. So we might as well confront straight away that if you do not believe in a devil who is a person, you are either remarkably right, given the history of the world. It is remarkable to think that there is no malevolent evil, or you are desperately deceived, which I'm afraid is the Bible's view of that view. We have got someone to fight, and the someone we fight is a fallen chief angel. and is therefore not a minor adversary, but compared to a human being, or frankly the whole human race, he is too cunning for us. The very first story in the Bible shows how cunning he is. He comes as a friend to question God's will and what God might really have meant. I wonder if there's anyone watching this video who's never had someone questioning what God might have meant, or indeed whether there is a God at all. And in that moment, you have decisions to make. Is this a question that I want to engage with? Or is this in fact part of the enemy's strategy? Well, Paul says you're going to face this, and it's a spiritual thing. If you are being deceived by your best friend, by your partner, by someone at work, you have to decide whether this is part of your spiritual struggle or whether you're just going to give way or be complacent about it. But the Bible's encouragement, Paul's encouragement to these Ephesian Christians, is you have to see it as a battle. You have to see it as something that you must resist in some way or another in the love of God. Because otherwise, you will not be able to stand in your faith. And that is the intention, to struggle and to stand at any given moment across the world and across our communities. There are people who are struggling. They are wrestling with issues, with enemies, with adversity. But the struggle that Paul is addressing here is at its heart spiritual, and has to therefore be a struggle which is made with spiritual resources, the armour of God. We cannot, by our intellectual ability, we cannot, by our ability as a strong personality or a forthright person, make the progress we need to make. We need the Lord. In the city of Ephesus itself, in Acts chapter 19, we read of a community riot that took place against the apostles. So this is a city where it is familiar for the believers to see that their faith is a battle, a struggle. But Paul does not want them to think of it as simply a struggle against, in their case, Demetrius, the silversmith, who had opposed Paul, but to see deeper than that. It is not a struggle against flesh and blood, against a merchant whose business is threatened by the church and its beliefs. It is a battle against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world. If we look at what we are up against, we will be defeated straight away. But if we look at who is on our side, or better, whose side we are on, we will never be defeated. And this is, again, a great Bible theme. If David, faced with Goliath, had looked at what he was up against, he would never have won that battle. Indeed, long before David defeated Goliath, the armies of the Israelites and King Saul himself, a striking man with great physical prowess, had looked at Goliath and there was no hope. But David looked at God and there was hope. Not just hope, but basically certain victory. And the story of David and Goliath is not really the story of the little man defeating the big man. It is faith defeating an adversary. This is the model for what we are looking at in Ephesians chapter 6. It is the faith of the Christian. It may be a very frail human being, but if their faith is strong, if the armour of God is in place, there is no enemy in this world that can defeat that faith, even if it goes through the route of martyrdom. So in a way, the great battle is on the inside of me and of you. When Jesus was on the Sea of Galilee with his disciples in a boat, Jesus was asleep and a storm blew up. Some of those disciples were familiar with storms in Galilee, but they were scared to death and afraid of drowning. And they woke Jesus up and said, "Don't you care? We're drowning." And Jesus, woken up in this violent storm, does not say, "Oh, that's quite a big storm. You do need my help." What he says to them, having calmed the storm with a word, is, "O you of little faith." The problem was never the storm or the boat or the sea. The problem was that they did not have the spiritual armour and strength for the struggle. They didn't trust God enough, to put it in a simpler sentence. And that is a huge issue for every believing person on their journey through, as Paul says here, this dark world. Against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Verse 13. Therefore put on the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. The full armour, not a ceremonial armour that looks good, but a full armour that fully protects. And Paul lists the features of the Christian's spiritual armour. And the issue is, again, the simple one. Do we take spiritual things seriously? It is quite easy to be involved in church, involved in Christian faith, as a kind of side hobby, one in which we may say our prayers from time to time and quickly, but not a centerpiece of who we are and what we do. But it's difficult to equate that to the idea of putting on the full armour of God, isn't it? And it would appear that if we have a half-hearted faith, we will find ourselves often wounded and maybe even led well astray. We need the full armour because of the adversary and the adversaries that we face. And so the full armour of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. So we don't need the full armour every moment of our lives, but we need to be ready. Jesus said to his disciples, "Watch and pray, that you enter not into temptation." We need to be watchful. It is not that the whole of life is a manifest threat to our faith, but we do not know when the threat will come. It is not that every day is a desperate struggle, but we do not know when the day of evil may come. Some of us live in easier countries than others. Some of us live in easier communities than others. Some of us live in easier families than others. Some of us are part of stronger churches than others. There's all sorts of differences between us, depending on when we live, how we live, where we live. But all of us, even the person in the most beneficent circumstances, all of us need the full armour for when the day of evil comes. And it is so that we will be able to stay standing. We don't actually have to defeat evil because Jesus has defeated evil. We must just be careful that evil doesn't defeat us. We must be able to stand. the full armour, truth, righteousness, the gospel of peace, faith, salvation, the word of God, prayer. Maybe when Paul wrote these words, he was chained to a soldier, and maybe because he was imprisoned, he saw soldiers dressed in their armour. And as he thought of the armour of God, he thought of the variety of ways that God has protected us and will protect us, and how we need to hold on to those things. But you notice that all of those things are spiritual. They are all spiritual. You cannot win the battle as an unspiritual Christian. You must believe. You must know God. You must pray. We must all do that if we are to be victorious as we travel through this world. And in a sense, although we use the idea of traveling through the world, we must all do this if we are to get through our time in this world still standing. I don't know what this week has for you, or this year. I don't know what it has for me. But whether I am able to still stand will depend on how much I have dressed myself in the armour of God, so that I am ready for anything. Let's finish by thinking of some words from one of John's letters. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 3. This is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. May God grant to you the ability to struggle, and therefore the ability to stand. And when all is done, to stand